turnout. I know it's getting a little colder in October, but we've still got a room full of people here. So before we get started, I just want to say a few quick words about who MASS LBP is and what we're working on right now. So for those of you who don't know, MASS is a new kind of company, and we're reinventing public consultation. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we work with visionary governments or corporations or organizations to help engage citizens and solve complex issues. We bring together randomly selected members of the public to teach them about and deliberate on important issues that are affecting their communities. So if you want to learn more about this process, which is quite complicated for a short evening, you can visit our website, which is masslbp.com, or you can pick up some of our sort of print collateral, which is right here. Some of the projects we're working on right now, one of the ones we're really excited about is Canada 2017, which is Canada's sesquicentennial. So in 2017, Canada will be celebrating its 150th birthday. And we want to make this a really amazing, spectacular year. So even though it's a long way off, we're already starting to think about what that will mean for Canada and how we can bring together Canadians so they can have some ownership in this important year. So to get the ball rolling, we're holding a conference, which is March 11th and 12th, 2010, and that's with the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, or IPAC, and we're holding that at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. And these MASS talks, we do these every month, so the next one will be on November 17th. And we'd also like to say a huge thank you to everyone at Gilead Cafe, of course Laura there, who brought the flyers out. And please feel free to help yourself to more drinks and refreshments as the evening goes on. We've also got another really special event coming up actually on Tuesday, October 13th. So we've invited Alan Weber from Fast Company magazine, and he'll be speaking at the Centre for Social Innovation about his new book. And this is a really unique chance to see Alan Weber in person in Toronto. So space is actually very limited for this event. It's going to be a popular evening. But we have some little sign-up sheets here. If you want to put down your email address, we can add you to that list for RSVPs. So again, that's Alan Weber, and that is on Tuesday, October 13th at the Centre for Social Innovation. But that's probably enough about us. I think it's time to introduce our speaker tonight, Les Klein, who's kindly agreed to come here tonight to talk about a very exciting new project, tackling perhaps one of the most controversial pieces of highway in this city. So Les is a founder and a principal of Quadrangle Architects Limited. He has a Bachelor of Science degrees, one in Arts and Design, another in Mathematics, and has a Master of Architecture from MIT. He's also served as adjunct professor at the U of T Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. He's been inducted into the College of Fellows of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and has received numerous awards for his work. So Quadrangle was founded in 1986, and it merged with Klein Taylor Goldsmith Limited and Kirker Brown Architects. Much of Quadrangle's work is focused on urban housing, broadcast and media facilities, and they're also experts in historical restoration. So you might be familiar with the Chum City building down at the corner of Queen Street there, which is now the headquarters of TV, so they were involved with that, as well as the Candy factory loft, just close to Trinity Bellwoods, and the BMW building, which is the one where you can see all the cars as you drive by through the windows, ogle all the beautiful cars. And they're really community focused. I think that's one of the things I learned most from reading a bit about Quadrangle on their website, is that they're really involved with community projects in a united way. And recently, Les was taking part in Ride for Heart along the Gardiner Expressway, the DVP, and started to wonder why they couldn't do this 365 days a year. So why do we have to limit this kind of pedestrian or cycle paths, for one day a year? So he has called his Green Ribbon proposal calls for a green roof to extend along 7 kilometers of the Gardiner Expressway to include more pedestrian space and more cycle paths, and basically to bring a huge swath of green to the downtown core. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Chris Ellis, who is with MASS LBP. and Les Klein to have a talk about the Green Ribbon Project and your good works at Quadrangle.
Welcome. So Les and I were talking about how to actually present this, as it has been getting a bit of media, and I think we're going to do a kind of an overview first. So the one thing that's going to be kind of unique about this MASS talk, we're going to involve the audience a little in that we do have a few boards that Les is going to be using as reference, and when we're through with them, we'd like to kind of line them up behind us here, starting with Patrick. I think you're the last guy now. Yeah. So we'll pass them over, and everyone can line them up for view later on. Okay. So Les, welcome, and how about you kind of start up?
Thank you. Well, as some of you may know, I first introduced this idea of the Green Ribbon in June of this year at the Idea City Conference, which Moses Neimer runs every year in Toronto for the last 10 years. And I've been really quite overwhelmed by the response that the idea has received. I now begin to understand the notion of an idea going viral. And luckily it's not H1N1 viral, but really viral. What I wanted to do is just to give you a bit of the background of how I presented this initially, and then hopefully through conversation give you an idea of where this idea is now and where hopefully it can go. So, I mean, first of all, I think one of the interesting things about Toronto, and I've lived here for quite a few decades, but I certainly wasn't born here, didn't grow up here, but Toronto in particular has a unique love-hate relationship with the car. We all want mass transit, and we want it to be great, but none of our local councillors or community groups are prepared to support the densities that are desperately needed to support a viable transit system. We also, all believe in being green, but we also get really pissed off when we can't park our SUV right in front of the video store. What is all this traffic? And all of this ambivalence really does color the way that we look at ideas like closing a lane of Jarvis Street, or, for that matter, tearing down the Gardiner. I'm a student of history, and I actually really love history, and so about 6 months ago when I first started speaking to other people about this idea, I had the opportunity to meet a gentleman named Fred Conlon. Fred Conlon is the great-grandson of Frederick Gardiner, the founder and the originator of the Gardiner Expressway. And he gave me a unique insight into how we got where we are. In the 1950s, as some of you may remember, or at least know about from your academics, the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto was created from 13 disparate little towns and villages and quasi-cities. And one of the needs that was identified very early on as a result of Hurricane Hazel, which killed many people and destroyed a huge amount of property, as well as I don't know how many of you know the infamous Boyd Gang. The Boyd Gang was a bank-robbing bunch of hoodlums who figured out really quickly that if you robbed a bank in Swansea and booted it over to Mimico, the Swansea cops couldn't catch you. So they kind of realized that there are certain things that are probably best delivered with a unified municipality. And Fred Gardiner, in his wisdom, had this great idea to build an expressway. And that expressway, I love this. This I actually got from Fred Conlon. This is the headline from the Telegram. Metro chairman sees crosstown through route. And what he saw initially, and according to the way he tried to sell it, was it's going to solve all kinds of traffic problems. But the reality is he saw this as a symbol of some way of tying these little towns and cities and very, very small minds together into a unified whole. It was a very exciting time for the city of Toronto. Construction began in 1956. It wasn't really completed until more than 10 years later. And it stretched ultimately 20 kilometers from the foot of the 427 all the way to beyond the Don Valley Parkway, if you can remember that far back. And it was a symbol. It was a symbol of growth. It was a symbol that Toronto had really arrived. I, in fact, got my first view of the Gardiner when I was driving in for the first time from Detroit, Michigan. And I remember that huge bump you have to go over at the Humber. And then the next thing I saw was this fabulous city, and the CN Tower almost finished, under construction. It was a pretty exciting time. But I think it's fair to say that over the last 3 decades, the Gardiner has been, shall we say, neglected. And that's being very, very charitable. It's been called ugly. It's been accused of being an obstacle to the waterfront. And it's been viewed as a symbol of suburban sprawl. But the reality is that all of those discussions have really led nowhere. We've seen Boston launch its big dig to huge, huge anticipation. It's going to cost $5 billion and be done in 2 years. $14 billion, and 7 years later it's done, except it leaks. Louisville did a fantastic job of creating what they call the Great Lawn under their raised expressway. Shanghai's created a work of art out of theirs using LED lighting. And nobody can deny, except for those who can't see the board, that the Gardiner is not exactly pretty. Right now, we have I think, created a campaign to keep it ugly. We use it to store construction debris, garbage, in the case of a garbage strike, of course. We house our homeless, and we also house impounded cars. So, you know, a real symbol of what a majestic urban engineering feat should be. I think the problem is that we have these promises and nobody can see beyond what it is today. So the idea that we put forward is really an attempt to bring people out of that and to think differently. If you think about the eastmost section of the Gardiner, which was taken down in 2001, where we tore down the section from the Don Valley to Leslie Street, there was a great promise. You know, don't worry about it. It's only going to add about 2 minutes to your driving time if you're coming from the beach. It won't be a problem, and it's going to really tie the 2 parts of the city together, Leslieville with the Portlands. Well, I don't know if any of you have been there. It certainly is nice, but I don't want to take my life into my hands trying to cross that street, except for the 2 street lights that there are between the end of the Gardiner and Leslie Street. It has not lived up to its promise. I think that there are still places in the city where you can actually see the original majesty of the Gardiner. My favorite spot is actually just near Fort York. And you stand under it and you actually get a sense of how beautiful it really once was and what it was, how it looked to our forebears 40 years ago. And of course, my favorite time of year is when we do the Ride for Heart, and we actually get to ride on the Don Valley and the Gardiner and see the city from above. One of the interesting concerns that people keep raising is, what does it feel like to be in a park up in the sky? Someday do that ride and get a feel for how spectacular it really is. And I think the problem is that the arguments to remove the Gardiner just don't hold water. If you think about creating a real obstacle to the waterfront, put all that traffic on surface and then see what happens. Forget the frustrated drivers, the scared pedestrians. Now you create a huge obstacle to the waterfront. And if you could figure out a way to bury it, you still haven't dealt with the railroads, which really are an obstacle between the waterfront and the city. So we're talking sideways about the issues. So we've talked a little bit about this before. I mean, my firm, Quadrangle, we've done a lot of projects, but for whatever reason, some of the best known ones are in fact what we call adaptive reuse. We've taken an old building, we've looked at it, we've identified that it has great bones, and we've given it new life. Whether it's the old 299 Queen Street, the new CTV building, or the new City TV, which we're doing at Young Dundas Square, or Candy Factory, the Toy Factory, the BMW building. All of these, all it required was a belief that it is not automatically worthless just because it's old or just because we've looked at it in a certain way. And I think that it's time to rethink the Gardiner and look at it in a different way. So, as mentioned, our proposal is really, why don't we take this down and we'll stick these up. Our proposal is to create a 7-kilometer long raised linear park that will run essentially from Dufferin to the Don Valley Parkway, built over the existing roadway. The existing roadway would actually remain. What it would do is to essentially create a green swath, our green ribbon, right through the center of the city. This is a very pretty view, which you'll get to look at later if you want, of what it would look like looking east. And in really simple terms, we've actually kind of not exactly dreamed it up, but we've looked at it. It's a very, very simple process of building a simple steel frame, and on top of that simple steel frame, putting a deck, and on that deck you can create your green space, your walking paths, your cycling paths, concession stands, because Toronto can't go more, in Vancouver you can't go more than 3 steps to a Starbucks. In Toronto you can't go more than 3 steps to a hot dog stand. So all of the things that we would really need. And in terms of access, the access would be created via a series of elevators large enough to carry bicycles and people, as well as stairs, as well as, if you're feeling particularly energetic, ramps that you could ride up or down or walk up or down. These would be at all the major intersections. These would also provide places for washrooms and concessions as well. And we would also have emergency ramps for emergency vehicles, for police, fire, ambulances, so that all of the expected concerns, all of which have been raised about 1 million times, by the way, to people who are thinking I'm out of it, especially the guy who posted a post that said, "Who gave this guy an architecture degree?" Anyway, the point of all of this is that it's also fundamentally green. It's a strange thing to say that it's green to keep an existing roadway, but aside from the fact that we're avoiding the inevitable traffic jams, not only during the construction of a surface road, but also post that, but also it gives us the opportunity to reduce the heat island effect in the middle of the city. I mean, if you've ever gotten stuck on who hasn't gotten stuck in a traffic jam on the Gardiner in the middle of a hot summer day? It is unbelievable the amount of heat that rises out of that. You cover that, all of a sudden you're avoiding the heat island effect. You're also creating a much safer condition. You're allowing people to drive on a roadway that doesn't have snow or rain or ice. We reduce the amount of salt that has to be dumped on this thing, which is the cause of its deterioration. You eliminate sun glare from the east and the west as you're driving, which I hear about all the time on the traffic network. And our idea also includes including solar panels around the perimeter, which would actually, and small wind turbines, which we're kind of looking into now. They're kind of cool. So and they look really good on the rendering, so we put them up there. But the idea would be to generate enough power to light all 3 levels, and also to provide snow melting. So you'd never have to actually have to bring a plow up there. The paths would be clear. So it's a very simple notion, but if you have, again, driven the Gardiner and seen how many buildings have already been built close to the Gardiner, and imagine that instead of those people looking down on a roadbed, they would be looking down on a green park, and you could in fact license buildings, office buildings, and condos to have direct access to the park. You kind of create a whole different notion to community participation. Again, we've kind of identified lots of other opportunities. The Queensboro Bridge in New York has a food market that was built underneath the bridge. There's lots of space below the Gardiner that has been neglected and lost. So all of these kinds of ideas are out there for discussion. Now, I would be extremely remiss to suggest to you that this is the answer. But the purpose of our bringing this idea forward is to move us away from the paradigm, which I'm afraid kind of runs rampant in Toronto, of black and white, of yes or no. You know, it's not just keep it or tear it down. There are lots of other alternatives. And our hope is that in the process of doing this, that we can generate some rational, reasoned debate about the value of these kinds of urban infrastructure components in our city. My suggestion to you is that this would not be a terrible thing to see when you first came into the city of Toronto, whether by air or by land or by sea. And our point in all of this is now is not the time to tear down the Gardiner. We are not ready for it. We don't yet have the transit for it. And once we tear it down, it's gone. This way, we actually create the opportunity for us to rethink all of the components of the Gardiner, to rethink what it could be. If in 20 years we decide that it's a fabulous place for a rapid transit line, great. If we decide in 20 years some really clever architect comes along and decides to turn it into artist lofts, great. But the point is, it is there, it's part of our history. And for us to say that as a result of the fact that we've been looking at it in its neglected form for 30 years, that as a result of that it's worthless, I think it would be a wrong thing to do. So I want to thank you for coming. I'd be happy to answer some questions that Chris has, some questions that you may have. I've also hoped that all of you have picked up the little booklet. The most important part of that little booklet is on the back. If you look, that we actually have a Facebook page. If you search our Gardiner Green Ribbon, you can become a friend or a fan. I got to tell you, like I said at the beginning, this whole viral thing has really blown my mind. Because I was on Adam Vaughn's show last week, and I finished, and Adam said goodbye, and I walked out the door, and by the time I took my BlackBerry out, there were 25 hits on it. So I figured if 1 out of 1,000 people actually got on the computer and said, okay, I think I'll be a friend, a lot of people watching. So I thank you for your time and for your interest and your patience, and I'm happy to talk about it, and thank you for coming on.
So we'll do a bit of a kind of a hosting thing with Les. We have a few questions that we've talked about to actually frame this within the idea or within the scope of revitalization of public space, which is what this talk, I think, was entitled. And I wanted to start off with a bit with kind of what you left off with, which is many other cities have actually done something with their public spaces that were not really meant for, I guess you could say, human consumption. Rail lines have been, pulled over with parkland, such as the High Line in New York City. That model has been used in several other cities in the U.S. I think Morwen was telling me about one that is beautiful in Paris.
Right.
And I want to kind of relate that to where we're at in Toronto. Are we ready for an idea like that? And is that something that you've kind of encountered as resistance? Can we take these big ideas? I know we're on a great trend with new buildings like, say, OCAD, the AGO, or WRONG. This is a much larger project.
There are a number of questions that you raised in that. First and foremost is Toronto ready for a big idea? I'm not sure, frankly. Toronto has always desperately wanted a big idea and then run very, very far away from it. One of the people that I've been speaking to of late has actually been former Mayor David Crombie, who's very enthusiastic about this idea, almost embarrassingly so. But I remember, the first time I ever heard of Toronto was when David Crombie passed the 45-foot zoning bylaw. No building will be built in Toronto that's more than 45 feet high, and it garnered international attention. Now, it didn't go anywhere because we got so scared of all that national attention that we ran away and I think we voted him out. But to answer your question, I think that there are real basic economic reasons for this. If you look at Chicago, for example, which is kind of my favorite example of it now, they spent, I believe it was $800 million to purchase the land and redevelop the Millennium Park in the center of the city. That investment has created something like 4 times that number in terms of increased property values. In Toronto, we are currently spending money on developing the Lower Donlands, the West Donlands, the East Bayfront, Liberty Village, Fort York neighborhood, the CNE. Imagine the value of the properties adjacent to the Gardiner, all of those things that we are currently spending taxpayers' dollars on. If instead of looking down on a hopelessly and endlessly polluted roadway, we're looking at for the purposes of discussion, let's say a green ribbon. It could be anything, something else, but just a different image. If we are prepared to invest that kind of energy, and to answer the last part of your question, the High Line, although it really is not anything like this proposal, has been an incredible boon to this project, because all of a sudden, if somebody's done something like this in New York, it might be okay for Toronto. So we've kind of been blessed by the big boys, so now we can play in their yard for a little while. I think that Toronto is ready for an idea like this. I hate to believe that, you know, all of this media hype has much more value than just hype, but I do believe, based upon the kind of reactions I've had from people, the people and the friends that I've met and people I've never met before who've said, I heard about your idea from my friend, and I can't believe what an incredible idea it is. I don't want to judge it. I'm very excited about it, and I think it has the potential to be a really good idea. What I love is the fact that at a grassroots level, at the level at which MASS LBP works, this has really gained, you know, kind of grasped people's imaginations and allowed them to think beyond ourselves.
Now, thinking on that, things have kind of changed over the, I guess, the past 50 years. An idea of this kind of magnitude, or any kind of architectural idea, may have been discussed in newspapers or, say, on television or radio shows. Now there is kind of this underlying kind of swell of people that are talking about them on places like, say, Facebook, or in smaller independent magazines like Spacings. Has this kind of helped people kind of accept and really want and grasp these larger ideas?
You know, I'm a novice. I'm kind of a little boy in the wilderness in this stuff, but I am amazed at how quickly and how uniquely ideas can infuse the public realm. The notion of an idea being engendered in some positive way is a wonderful thing. I mean, I recognize that there's a lot of crap out there in the ether. But once in a while, something kind of shines through, a wonderful concept, a wonderful image, a wonderful and meaningful statement or a speech. And when that is allowed to spread beyond those people who were in the room, or those people who read the newspaper that one day, I think it has real magic. It has real potential to inspire, real opportunity to raise people.
And this is kind of the ethos that you've really kind of latched onto with Quadrangle as well. You're really taking, you know, spaces that are currently disused or people think should be kind of trashed, and again, you're revitalizing. And is that kind of, what got you on that idea as well?
Well, again, we're kind of counter-revolutionary in the architectural world in the sense that we're not really so focused on the object per se as we are on the context in which the object sits. When you're an architect and you go for an interview, the first thing they ask you is, well, so what's your style? And our problem is we can never answer that question. So we usually say, well, we have style, but we don't have a style. And it's cute, but it doesn't work. But what we have kind of recognized is that we got to come up with a label. So the label we often use is that we're contextualists. And what we mean by that is that we draw our excuses, our reasons, our rationale for our designs from the context around us, whether it's the physical context or the historical context, or for that matter, the social context. It's really what informs our architecture. How people feel, not only how people move through the space, but how they're going to feel when they move through the space, and how they're going to be able to connect to what that space is now, will be in the future, and was in the past. I think is a really interesting, highly intangible, very difficult to explain to institutions, but a real way for us to work. And you know, we've been doing it for a long time, and it's not that we think it's the only way to do it, but it certainly has suited our belief that cities grow best when they grow organically. Huge upheavals don't really do either the society or the people who live in them much good, but an organic, holistic kind of growth can really engender a sense of community.
Now, a lot of the other projects that Quadrangle have done, like the city TV building and a few others, they go through this idea of revitalization, but none of them have really been as free to the public as this. How were you able to wrap your head around that in that way?
You know,
because it is different than you, right?
You know, at some point you feel strongly enough about something, you just kind of gotta say, okay, I'm gonna stick my neck out, and if they chop it off. I have been so struck by the dogmatic nature of the debate around the Gardiner. This notion that it has to come down. You know you're a celebrity when you've made it onto the Weather Network. So the Weather Network actually came and did a little 2-minute piece on the green ribbon idea. And one of the people from Waterfront Toronto was there, was interviewed as part of it. And he said, well, you know, our preferred idea is to take down the Gardiner, and it has been for many, many, many years. This is one of the ideas that we will consider. And don't get me wrong, I really like the gentleman. I know him personally. But he toed the party line, and it has been the party line for way too long. So I think that the notion of being able to think big, think differently, and allow yourself to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. Ideally, put yourself into Fred Gardiner's really big shoe, and see what he saw 50 years ago, and see if we can regain that same incredible energy that was there in Toronto 50 years ago when we created the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. In the same way, as if you mentioned it, that I'm sure that the Ryerson Book Publishing Company must have looked on 299 Queen Street West as a magnificent example of their ethos and their contribution to city making when they first built that spectacular building. We then saw it fall into decline, and with a little bit of vision and a little bit of imagination, and a little bit of money, we managed to create it and give it another 50 years of life.
So, do you think we're still in this rut, or what's the real barrier in your mind? I think there's probably several. Is this a political issue? We could kind of laugh about that. Outright.
Yeah.
Or is this a money issue? Is this a public perceptions issue?
Yeah.
Or is this, more fundamentally in my mind, is this a cultural issue for the people in Toronto, or even Canada, if we're not really thinking on this kind of scale anymore? The one thing that Morwenna mentioned is the 1967 centennial and the 150th anniversary of Confederation that will be coming up in 2017.
Yeah.
Those are possibilities of, like, pushing the envelope and thinking big. But are we we as Canadians or Torontonians, are we getting in this, we're on the up ramp, as it were?
Well, we've been beat up a lot. I often joke that architects should be allowed to have like little ribbons the way army people do. This was from the recession of '82, and this was from 1990, and I survived the recession of 2001. We get beat up a lot because our economics seems to drive most of our vision. And I know that it's not easy. People work hard and they try to put together a life for their families and themselves and the people that they really care about. But sometimes we got to just think outside of ourselves. And I know myself that this project or a project like this will not be built without a lot of people, like the people sitting in this room, at least those who agree, to actually putting pressure and saying, let's get out of this rut. Let's start thinking positively. We really believe in the city. I mean, there's an awful lot of people who have voted with their feet and moved down to the city of Toronto and live there now the way, when we moved our office to King and Spadina, it was a wasteland. But now it's a vibrant part of the community, and it's been revitalized in very much the same way as this can create revitalization along our waterfront.
So I kind of have to ask, I was going to save it for later, but what other kind of big ideas are rolling around your head? Or is this are you holding on to this one?
Come on, I only get one. This is 15 minutes of fame, right? No, look, the reality, and this is maybe terrible to say, but I'm in the incredibly enviable position of going to work every day and working on fabulous projects with fabulous people, both clients and staff. The fact that I've been lucky enough to get enjoyment out of every one of those is something that, it's an embarrassment of riches. I hope that 20 years from now, people will continue to look around and say, wow, that's another great quadrangle building. And I hope they don't associate it with me, but really with our staff, who are amazingly visionary and believe the same things that we believe, that there's something fundamental to human society about making great cities.
I'm going to ask one more question, which was just...
Come on, it's such a great ending.
Well, I'll leave this one out because every time I've talked
everybody's
about
going
this,
like this too, right?
Every time I've talked about this, everyone kind of asks me, like, how long would this kind of take? Like, if the Tooth Fairy came and left
$700 million?
There you go. Under your pillow, tonight. When would something like this be
Well, there are processes that have to be gone through. This is responsible for environmental assessment, all that. We have done the costing. We know that the cost of building this is well under half of what it would cost to tear down the Gardiner and rebuild the existing roadway. So this is about $700 million. The costs for the other are range from 1.2 to 1.8 billion. And you still get the Gardiner. And it would probably take a number of years, probably take about 4 years to build, because what we would want to do, and I'm actually working with structural engineers and contractors to figure it out, we'd want to build it in such a way that the traffic flow would not be disrupted. So we'd actually build it in sections, probably 500-meter long sections, and since there are 7 kilometers, probably about 14 sections, each of which would be 6 months. So something like 3 to 4 years. But it could be done, and it certainly could be done a lot faster with more money. But that's neither here nor there. What we know now is that it's feasible, and that from a financial point of view, it makes sense. It's not a fly-by-night idea, nor is it unbelievably expensive. It's a very simple technology and a very simple structure with some really, really simple benefits.
Excellent. Kind of wanted to get that question out of the way because I know it's going to come up. I can just feel it. But with
Were you going to ask that question? We'll soon find out.
But with that, I kind of wanted to open up the questions to the floor, and I'll try to come up with some semblance of a way to organize this. So,
the gentleman in the back that had his hands raised.
Yeah, I just, we keep, I'm trying to figure out how I can learn to love the gardens. I'm trying to get my head around that.
Yeah.
But they keep comparing the Gardiner with grabs underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And then you hear of bridges in Montreal just collapsing.
Yeah.
Because who knows why, the bars are
Yeah.
its integrity. Does the Gardiner have that kind of structural integrity that you could actually project the life? And are you going to have to reinforce it and so on to maintain the structure?
The Gardiner continues to have deterioration problems, mostly surface deterioration, because we're dumping an incredible amount of water and salt on it every single year. And there's nothing worse for concrete, reinforced concrete, or steel than salt. So there is no question that once you cover it, that deterioration will slow. It won't stop, but it'll slow. There is no one, in fact, no one has said, come out and said that the Gardiner is dangerous or imminently about to fall. On the contrary, I won't say this too loud, but the fact that it was built 50-some years ago actually gives me enormous confidence, because they seriously overbuilt in those days, and they knew how to build something for a lot longer than we build typically today. So I don't have any concerns about that, and in fact I think our proposal is one of a number of possible answers to solve that particular problem.
But what kind of a lifespan are you projecting for this whole structure?
At this point, another 50 years is not at all unreasonable.
Sure. I just have a quick question. I've heard of plants being used to remediate brownfield. And I was curious, given the fact there's so much car traffic over top of this park you're talking about, have you looked into the type of plants you could actually put into this park that might be able to offset some of the environmental costs of the traffic?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to use that as a bit of a segue, because plants are not my expertise. But having kind of proposed this idea, I recognized a few weeks or a couple of months ago that if I'm going to commit myself to kind of talking about this, it can't be me. So I have actually reached out to a number of people who are of like mind, who have been involved with the Gardiner for a long time, and we're talking about building what we're currently calling the Green Ribbon Coalition. And the idea is really to reach out to a whole lot of other like-minded people that would be interested in taking on those kinds of issues. So we're in fact presenting at Construct Canada and the Green Building Conference in December, a seminar called the Green Ribbon Coalition, where we're going to, one of Toronto's best-known landscape architects, Janet Rosenberg, will talk about planting and how to deal with the planting and how to program parks. in public spaces. John Van Nostrand, who is one of Toronto's foremost urban planners, and who's been a long advocate of cleaning up the underside of the Gardiner, is also going to be on that panel. We're talking about reaching out to everybody from alternate energy suppliers to urban agriculturalists to the arts community to neighborhood groups who actually hope to actually have an impact on their immediate community. So certainly planting is one of those, and environment is one of those. And I'm hoping that by building that kind of coalition, that we get the expertise needed to answer very insightful questions that we put forward.
One of the biggest things you can do is just not, from a green point of view, is just not tear it down and replace it. It doesn't matter whether it's a building, a road, or whatever, because so much energy goes into new materials and getting rid of old materials that you made a big enough green statement just doing that, regardless of anything else you do.
Now, this is coming from Mike Cruikshank, who has saved one of the most beautiful buildings in the city, in the carpet factory in Liberty Village. But interestingly enough, I've been speaking, among other people in the coalition, I've been speaking to people who know how to finance infrastructure projects. One of the most creative things one of these guys threw out on the table was that there is an incredible amount of embedded energy in the existing Gardiner. And if there is a way of creating tax carbon credits for not tearing down the Gardiner, like really convince David Miller to tear it down and then stop him from doing that, we've built up all these tax credits for carbon emissions. Anyway, a little bit crazy, but the notion is that there is, I mean, besides the energy embedded in it, there's the energy of tearing it down, and the energy of trucking the stuff away, and the energy of dumping all of that into a landfill site, either Lake Ontario or, you know, Tobermory. You don't have to do that, and it is the most green thing you can do, is to work with what's here.
Lisa.
I know this is maybe looking a little bit further down the line than you're
Please
proposing right now, but I mean, one of the big things that people keep talking about is like increasing access to the waterfront, and also, as you mentioned, you know, the cool setting underneath the Gardiner. So how does this address both questions, like the access to the waterfront, increasing it, and looking at what to do underneath it?
I think, you know, fundamentally, it's my contention that by Fred Gardiner's vision of separating fast-moving vehicular traffic from pedestrian traffic below, you have in fact improved the access to the Gardiner. As we improve access over the railway lands towards the waterfront, we will be able to solve that problem. The real issue is, how do we avoid having, well, you'll see it, but how do we avoid that dank feeling that we feel underneath it now? And folks, it's just about design. I mean, Anwar will do it tomorrow. He'll sketch you 14 great ideas for how to make that thing the most spectacular place in the city. There are lots of talented people who know how to make those things happen. The question is, do we have the will?
There we go. Yes, great.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine, you know, going for a relaxing stroll in this park and sitting there and reading a book, and meanwhile there's, you know, hundreds of vehicles per minute flying by underneath, spewing fumes and honking and screeching around each other. You know, I'm wondering, the experience of being in this park would be quite different from any other park. And have you guys thought about, you know, will that be a place that people will want to go to?
I don't think that the pollution is an issue. The pollution will be the amount of pollution that currently develops until we ultimately do figure out that the best way to control traffic into the city is to toll the cars that drive, which will solve that whole issue at one fell swoop. But when you're up top and you're sitting on a deck that's 120 feet wide, there is below you, some 80 feet below you, a roadbed, and between you and that roadbed are 5 to 8 feet of dirt, with at some point some fairly heavy and significant trees and brush and landscaping. I think what you will feel is that you're in a magical place. I don't think that you will hear much from that. You may hear it, from the condos next door if you decide to sunbathe in the nude. But other than that, you won't hear much. It will be the normal ambient noise of the city. rather than sitting on top of the Gardiner. There's nothing more powerfully acoustic than weight. And putting 5 feet of dirt on top of that would have that effect.
Okay. Saw a few other.
You're all being incredibly patient standing
I
there.
see a gray arm back there.
Gray arm?
I just wanted to touch on the other side of the coalition that you mentioned. I think it's great that you're reaching out to people for expertise, but I was wondering if you, aside from the Facebook group, if you've given any consideration to how to keep people or bring people in. I know that the Highline, there's superficial similarities.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why it got, I think, built was the strength of the Friends of the Highline.
Right,
And they have
right.
these sort of dogged advocates
Yeah.
for it. And so I think that it's great that there's such quick support. The only problem with that is that it can quickly dissipate. So
Right.
how do you go about organizing a really sort of holding on to
Well,
it's going to end up being a political.
I'm hoping that you'll tell me. I am not a fundamentally political person, but I sure am learning fast. I did in fact ask David Crombie, you know how to organize politically. Here's what I've done so far, but what do I do next? And he said, well, for an amateur, you're not doing too badly. But the reality is, I'm not sophisticated in that way. But I agree with you 100% that this idea will die if it remains exclusively in the realm of the politicians, or B, it remains exclusively in the realm of the experts. I think the only way that this will happen is if there's really a grassroots, however that's defined in Canada. I was told that 50 letters to Parliament is a grassroots revolution. But the reality is if we build a grassroots component to this coalition that says, start thinking outside the box, you people who are controlling the political process and the purse strings. If we can do that, then I think we will succeed. I don't yet know how to do it because as I said, I'm naive in this new world. But I really, and I say this in all modesty, I was knocked over by the media frenzy that occurred on the 18th and 19th and 20th of June when we unveiled this thing. It was nuts. I had no idea that this was going to happen. And I was thrilled. But I also saw what you said, which is that 3 days later, it was kind of calming down. And what's happened is that every so often, something else has picked it up and thrown the interest back on. So the Weather Network, of course, but also Sun TV is doing a series the third week of October on 5 architects and their vision for Toronto 2020. Now, they should have said 2017, but they didn't.
Absolutely.
And there's going to be a forum similar to this at the Gardiner, no relation, the Gardiner Museum. After that, there's going to be this conference in September. The Walrus is doing a presentation on it in January, February, post-industrial parks. So it's this kind of one more thing that keeps feeding the fire, that keeps the idea alive and keeps it in the public realm. That part I can do. The real great organizing part, is there anybody out there who knows how to organize stuff? Alan knows how to organize people. Anyway, I'm hoping that other people will pick this up because I don't intend to make this a Les Klein issue. I hope to make it a Toronto issue.